I'm really happy to be able to moderate this talk and honored to moderate this talk with Mike, who I've known for a number of decades. And he has spent more than nearly a quarter century. I think it's 24 years, right, Mike? 24 years as a foreign correspondent for CNN. And he was the network's first Beijing bureau chief and senior Asia correspondent. And this talk will be about his book, Assignment China, kind of mentioning the arc of Western correspondents, mainly US, but also some who are not Americans, representing US media entities living and working in China from Mao to now. And it's quite a trajectory. And so I'll turn it over to Mike, and then we'll take questions from everyone. Thanks so much. Mike, over to you.
Thanks very, very much, Melinda. Actually, I think we met earlier than 1980 when you were working for the Far East Economic Review's China Trade Report. I was calculating, it's about 45 years, which is quite frightening.
Wow. Okay. Maybe I was just a baby at that time.
Anyway, it's great to be here. Thank you for organizing it, and thank all of you for deciding to join in. What I'd like to do is briefly sketch out some of the main themes in my book, Assignment China, and then we can open it up for questions and discussion. And so to begin, I want to hit the rewind button and go back even earlier than that. I want to go to 1973, just 1 year after Richard Nixon's trip to China. When I made my first visit to China. That's me on the right in the Mao cap and much longer and not gray hair. I went to China with a student group, and one of the places that we were taken was called the Wusan People's Commune outside Shenyang. And it was here that we were introduced to a guy named Yu Kexin and his family. He was presented as the sort of model Maoist peasant. And after getting the typical brief introduction about how great everything was, we then had lunch at his house. And I remember that as sort of the highlight of the trip, a chance to sort of have a real personal interaction with somebody. It was absolutely fantastic meal. So 20 years later, as CNN's Beijing bureau chief in 1993, I decided to retrace that 1973 trip to see how the country had changed in the intervening 20 years. So I managed to find Yu Kexin, and I discovered that he was now running a tractor repair shop. He lived in a new flat. He had a television set. As a beneficiary of the market-oriented reforms that had been introduced by Deng Xiaoping in the 1980s, his life had clearly improved. But as soon as the local officials were out of earshot, Yu confessed to me that almost everything I'd seen on that first visit in 1973 had been an illusion. He told me that, in fact, conditions back then were terrible, that they were lucky to have meat once a month, and that even the food I had so enjoyed had actually been trucked in from the city by local officials the day before, just to impress the foreigners. And to me, this episode underscores a central theme in any discussion about the history and experiences of foreign correspondents who've covered China. And that is the challenge of finding the truth in a vast, complicated country with a long history of distrust of outsiders and secretive and authoritarian political system. Over the decades, reporters for the American media, like Michael Forsyth, pictured here, previously with Bloomberg News and now with the New York Times, have profoundly influenced U.S. views on China, as well as the policies and success of American governments. Moreover, because of the reach of news organizations like the Times or the wire services or the networks like CNN, such coverage has had a disproportionate impact in shaping perceptions of China, not only in the States, but around the world. But for many consumers of news, however, the way the way the information that they read in newspapers or online, or that they see on television or hear on the radio actually gets there remains a mystery. And few people understand what goes into the reporting and the writing and the transmitting of news. Yet, as I'm sure any Melinda and any other journalist or former journalist will acknowledge, the process decisively shapes any news report. This, by the way, is Evan Osnos, who covered China for many years for The New Yorker. And so with China emerging as a global superpower, to me, it seems that understanding the people who've covered the country for the American media and how they've done so is crucial to helping everyone understand the news they're reading and watching, and providing that understanding is the central goal of Assignment China. This, by the way, is a photo of Joe Kahn, who covered China in the late 90s and early 2000s for the New York Times, and is today the executive editor, the editor-in-chief of the New York Times. And his personal insights and recollections, along with those of Mike Forsyth, Evan Osnos, and well over 100 others I interviewed, including Melinda, make up the heart of the book. The story of the journalists in Assignment China begins with the triumph of Mao Zedong's communist revolution in 1949, at which point virtually all American and other Western journalists were forced to leave the country. For most of the 3 decades that followed, American correspondents had little choice but to cover China from outside, most notably from the then British colony of Hong Kong. The China Watchers, as they became known, relied primarily on the official Chinese media, which they monitored religiously, looking for clues, plus the occasional assortment of refugees and the odd foreign visitor to the mainland. It was a frustrating beat, especially when China was convulsed with upheavals like the Cultural Revolution of the mid-late 1960s, which American correspondents couldn't see for themselves. In fact, it was only with President Richard Nixon's trip to China in 1972 that the door began to open. At that time, China had been so cut off for so long that many of the American journalists I interviewed for Assignment China who went on the Nixon trip described it as a sensation not much different from going into outer space. In the wake of the Nixon trip, China did become slightly more open to American and other Western media. This is a photo of Ted Koppel of ABC News and cameraman John Lauer in China in 1973, the year I made my first visit. But it wasn't until the U.S. and China established formal diplomatic relations in 1979, a step that was marked by Deng Xiaoping's historic trip to the U.S. and the famous moment where he wore a cowboy hat at a rodeo in Texas. It was only after that that American news organizations were finally allowed to open bureaus in Beijing, and the overall size of the resident foreign press corps was allowed to expand significantly. Among the first American journalists to be based in Beijing was, of course, Melinda, who, as she mentioned, opened the Newsweek bureau and features prominently in Assignment China. What followed were several decades in which the People's Republic became increasingly accessible to American and other foreign journalists, although there were always obstacles and limitations. When I became CNN's first Beijing bureau chief in 1987, for example, official regulations required reporters to get permission 10 days in advance for any travel outside Beijing, such as this trip I made with my camera crew to Tibet. Plus, we always had to be accompanied by government minders. Moreover, contact with ordinary Chinese was a challenge, and there were more than a few cases of American reporters, of ordinary Chinese who had dealings with American reporters being jailed, and the correspondents themselves being called in and questioned by the police. Still, throughout the 1980s, in fits and starts, as China began to open more to the foreign press. This is Richard Bernstein, who was Melinda's competitor as the first Time magazine bureau chief. And this happened as Chinese society itself began to open up. Then you had the Tiananmen Square crisis of 1989 and the historic live coverage by CNN and other television networks. This was largely due to an accident of history, the visit by Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev to put an end to the 30-year-long Sino-Soviet dispute, a visit which prompted Chinese leaders to agree to give permission to CNN and other Western broadcast networks to bring in satellite dishes and other transmission equipment, only for the protesters to literally steal the stage on which the Gorbachev visit was to have played out. Today, when it's possible to transmit video live from almost anywhere via an iPhone, it's easy to lose sight of just how unprecedented such coverage was. It captured attention around the world and presented a picture of China dramatically different from the narrative the Chinese Communist Party had long sought to impose on foreign journalists. Then there was the crackdown on June 3rd and 4th and the crushing of the protest movement, the coverage of which produced a sea change in American perceptions of China. By the early 1990s, much of the foreign media focus remained on the bitter legacy of 1989, and the result was that it took a while for American and other foreign journalists to sort of come to the realization that Deng Xiaoping was making crucially important moves to revive his program of economic reform, most notably with his famous Southern tour in 1992. But then press attention swiftly shifted to chronicling the dramatic social, economic, and even political changes that were triggered by the boom. This new atmosphere also led to a significant improvement in conditions for foreign journalists. It became much easier to travel, and local officials became much more accessible. By the late 90s, the China beat was entering what some foreign correspondents I interviewed for Assignment China would describe as its golden age. It was an exhilarating period. China's economy was turning into the manufacturing hub for the world, and foreign journalists were able to dig into Chinese society in ways that had previously been difficult, if not impossible. Trying to make senses of the paradoxes of a country where one day you'd be covering the jailing of a dissident, and the next day you'd be covering the opening of the world's largest airport or interviewing another Chinese entrepreneur who'd become a millionaire. 2008 was the climax of this period when Beijing hosted the Summer Olympics. In the run-up to the Games, the government lifted many long-standing restrictions on the movements and activities of foreign correspondents. In the wake of the Games, though, China's domestic political climate and its external behavior began to change. I'm convinced that the financial crisis that rocked the West in 2008 and 2009 was a critical factor because it led China's leaders to conclude that the U.S. and the West were in decline, and the time was right for Beijing to show a more assertive face to the rest of the world, and that included its treatment of the foreign media. For reporters, China increasingly became and remains an extremely challenging beat, as American and other foreign journalists have found themselves regularly tailed, harassed, blocked, sometimes even physically assaulted. While not as bad as the Mao era, my sense from outside, and it's been many years since I worked as a journalist at all, and even longer since I was based in Beijing, but my sense from the outside is that the climate for China-based reporters is now more restricted than at any time since the late 1970s. Then on top of this, you had the restrictions that were triggered by the COVID pandemic. And then in the middle of that, you had the mass expulsions of American reporters from leading media such as the Wall Street Journal, the Washington Post, and the New York Times in 2020, and continuing visa difficulties for so many American and other news organizations still today. So the result is that the size of the foreign press corps in China has shrunk from its peak of a number of years ago. And that has meant increasingly journalists are having to cover China from outside the country. The number of previously China-based correspondents here in Taipei, where I have lived for the last 18 months, for example, is just one sign. In some ways, it seems like a modern day version of the art of China watching that emerged in Hong Kong in the 1950s, when the country was largely inaccessible to the American and Western press, has become increasingly important. So I want to end by recalling the work of the man generally considered in the field to have been the greatest of all the China watchers, Father Laszlo Ladany. Ladany was a Hungarian Jesuit who lived and worked in China in the 40s. After being forced to leave, he moved to Hong Kong, and for more than 30 years, he published a weekly newsletter called the China News Analysis. It became the Bible for multiple generations of journalists, myself included. It was based entirely on Father Ladany's reading and interpretation of the official Chinese media, newspapers, radio broadcasts, and documents. He was fluent in Chinese, and he really mastered the art of deciphering the real meaning of the rhetoric, the jargon, the slogans, the obscure historical references, and all the statistics pumped out by the Chinese Communist Party. Today, however, reporters do have other tools that did not exist during the time of Father Ladany. That includes monitoring the Chinese internet, which despite censorship can still provide critical insights. It also includes commercially available satellite imagery, Here's one very interesting example from late last year. These are satellite pictures of a crematorium just outside Beijing. You can see on the left, the parking lot is empty, and you can see on the right, the parking lot is full. And the only difference is the picture on the left was taken in early December, and the picture on the right was taken in late December after the lifting of the zero COVID policy. So it was one way for journalists to document the death toll rose very dramatically once the policy had changed. Another way in which reporters are trying to cover China today is by reporting on China's international activities, which have grown very, very dramatically. So one example is this report recently in the Wall Street Journal about problems in many high-profile construction projects that are part of the Belt and Road Initiative. Still, the sharp drop in American and other foreign media access to China, I think, is really a huge blow to our understanding of the country, because the ability of foreign correspondents to go around and talk to people and witness for themselves what's going on has been so severely limited. Being there is the essential foundation for good journalism, and that's become harder and harder to do. So I suspect reporters who are covering China from the outside, and even those few who are still in the mainland, are going to need to channel their inner Father Ladani more and more as they work to make sense of a story that is only growing in importance, even as it becomes more difficult to cover. Anyway, let me stop there and open it up for your comments and questions. Thanks for your attention.
Thanks so much, Mike. Great memories there. Some good, some not so good. I should add that what you just described, the view from inside China, is very accurate, because I'm still based in China. I'm the Newsweek bureau chief there. Again, this is my second posting. And I should explain, however, that today I happen to be in London, and I'm moderating this talk from London, appropriately enough, from a meeting room in the Frontline Club, which is a great club. Many of its members are journalists and news photographers. And so thank you, Frontline, for being such a welcoming environment for the media. In my experience, okay, I arrived in Beijing in March 1980. I haven't been based there nonstop since then, but I had, even when I was posted elsewhere, like in Hong Kong for a number of years, and also in the U.S. for a number of years, China was always part of the beat. And so I, along with Mike, I also covered a lot of the events. And one of the questions that I want to ask you, Mike, is one that I ask myself as well. I definitely think there were some illusions, to use a word that your friend Yu told you, about China from the very start, that now I wish I hadn't had those illusions, when I look back at some of my writing. Perhaps one of the most notable of them was in like 1998 to 1999, when I thought, oh, the internet, it's going to make us all free. The internet is going to unify everybody. No information will be secret anymore, and all that. And of course, today we see it's much different. So in terms of illusions that we might have had, what do you think, Mike? What sorts of things do you know now that you wish we had all known decades ago?
Well, it's a very good question, and I think the problem is accentuated by the fact that journalists, with very, very rare exceptions, are prisoners of the medium. And so at CNN, if I could get a story in 2.5 minutes on the air, I considered that a triumph. To get more than 800 words in a wire service story, or 800 or 1,000 words in a newspaper, maybe you had the luxury in a weekly news magazine of doing longer and not being prisoner of daily events and deadlines. So there was this constant pressure to sort of simplify even oversimplify to explain things to an audience which might be interested and curious in China, but had no understanding, background knowledge, or context. So that's factor one. I challenge anybody in this audience to, when we finish, write a 90-second report about what we said today and see what's in it and what you didn't put in, and you get an idea of what happens when you're a journalist. And then add to that, assume that somebody is, chasing you, trying to stop you from listening or shooting a gun at you, and you get a little bit of a sense of what it's like for the foreign correspondents. So that's part of it. And I think, it's also, to some degree, it looked at various times, amazing things were happening in China. And on the one hand, for example, remember I interviewed Jim Laurie, who was the first ABC News correspondent. And he talks about so much of the early coverage at the networks, and I think it's true beyond the networks, it was all a series of firsts. The first private restaurant, the first fashion show. I remember very soon after I opened the CNN Bureau in '87, there was the first international makeup exhibition at the big exhibition hall. And there were these crowds of young women. They almost literally battered down the doors to go inside and see the exhibits by Revlon and Estee Lauder and so on. So this narrative took hold that as China was kind of emerging from the very dark days of the Cultural Revolution, there was this repressed curiosity and enthusiasm and openness to foreign things. So if you weren't careful, it wouldn't be that much of a leap to say they're going capitalist. If all Chinese women want to, wear Estee Lauder makeup, what does that tell you about the values of Chinese women? If Chinese students all want to go to Harvard Business School, what does that mean for their economy? And so I think some people more than others got caught up in that at various points. And I think in the process, they lost sight of certain deeper truths about China and about the Chinese Communist Party. And when you see a tough old communist leader like Deng Xiaoping wearing a cowboy hat at a rodeo, it makes him like the cuddly communist. And so, reporters were caught up in that. And I think I think that helped, that contributed at various times to a sense of, the changes were profound, but that didn't mean they were becoming like us. They were becoming a different Chinese reality, not becoming an American reality. But if you're trying to explain that to people in Iowa, it's a blurry line for how do you get them to get it without oversimplifying to the point that you missed something.
Right, absolutely. And you mentioned the dramatic decrease in the numbers of foreign correspondents in Beijing. I was the president of the Foreign Correspondents Club in China from 2004 to 2008. And we just took it as got to keep liberalizing, but of course it didn't. Not only were some of those freedoms sort of rolled back in other ways, but the numbers, the pressures and the bureaucratic realities of being based in China meant that the numbers shrunk. And so in 2008, right before the Summer Olympics in Beijing, there were 700 plus foreign correspondents, individual ones based in China. And today, I don't have the exact numbers because some people are accredited, but they're not physically present. But we're talking not that many more than about half of that number. And you mentioned the great negatives as a result of that reduction of the in-person presence. And we've got a great question from an RASBJ member, William Henbury Tennyson, because we've seen an uptick in the number of people who are trying to cover China from Taiwan. How good is coverage of the mainland by Taiwan newspapers?
My guess would be that given both the constraints on the correspondence and the nature of the the media landscape in China, just in terms of the caliber of the newspapers and the TV stations, you're not going to get much in the way of in-depth coverage from Taiwan journalists. And there are lots of foreign journalists, some of whom were kicked out of China, who are here, others who want to go to China and are either haven't gotten the visa approved or they're using this as the listening post. And there's kind of constant discussion about, is this a good place? Hong Kong has sadly lost that role. And that's largely because of the extremely onerous restrictions imposed by the national security law. Between that and China's refusal to allow anybody that was expelled to go to Hong Kong to be based anymore, and the fact that in Hong Kong, the national security laws meant many people are really afraid to talk to reporters. Hong Kong has lost that role, which is too bad, because there's enough back and forth in Hong Kong that, you know, it might otherwise still be a decent place. Taiwan is, you know, it's Chinese culture. Everybody speaks Chinese. It's all, you know, Chinese language and so on. There certainly are Taiwan, you know, experts who follow China. But I don't honestly know if, you know, if you've got good Chinese and you can read the internet, you know, that's what a lot of China coverage from out China is. And you can do that from here and then go out and get a really good Chinese meal and talk Chinese to your taxi driver. But you can do it in Seoul. I mean, there's a whole cottage industry in the States of publications that are doing very good coverage. You know, there's The Wire that was set up by David Barboza, who won a Pulitzer for the New York Times for his expose about the hidden wealth of family members of Premier Wen Jiabao. Bill Bishop runs a newsletter called Sinocism. Politico has a very good guy doing a weekly China thing. So there are lots of places, and Taiwan is just one of them. But the problem is one of the problems in not having people on the ground is that the focus then becomes official statements, diplomacy, international relations, you know, military posturing. What you're not getting by not having enough people there is the human side of the story. It's next to impossible now for somebody to do what, I'll give you an example from the book. Ed Gargan, who was the New York Times correspondent in 1987, was allowed to go and spend 10 days in a village in northern Guangdong province. He just went and he stayed in a farmer's home and he hung out in this village for a month, for 10 days. And he wrote a really interesting piece about what life was like in the village, you know, ups and downs, pros and cons, but that's extremely hard to do now. I can't imagine the difficulties of somebody to get permission and to get beyond the layers of minders and so on. So the result, and I think this is not only bad for the journalism and bad for the understanding of the public, it's bad for China. I mean, Chinese officials always complain about China's story not being told well. But if you don't let people go out and cover the country, the focus is going to be on this, you know, the exchanging of insults between the other governments and, you know, Western politicians denouncing China and China denouncing them, and, you know, the international stuff and the texture, the reality is, like any country, China is not black and white. It's multiple shades of gray. And the sense of, you know, what the lives of ordinary Chinese are like, what their hopes and dreams and fears and aspirations and struggles and triumphs and tragedies that humanize the country and make it not this kind of caricature of the new evil empire, which is the narrative that's taking hold increasingly in the West, I think is bad for our understanding of China. And it's bad, you know, it's an own goal on China's part not to see that, but the Chinese system is not good at nuance and shades of gray. So there you are.
Right. Okay. We're getting questions thick and fast here from the audience. So why don't we switch over to there? And there is one question from a mutual friend of ours, another old China hand from the media, Francesco Sisi, an Italian journalist who is in Beijing now. And he asks, Mike, with all your long-term experiences, how do you guess China will evolve in the next couple of years? What will be China in 2025?
Well,
we only have till 1 o'clock, so get going.
That's right. And also I'm glad to say I don't work for CNN anymore. So instead of embarrassing myself by incorrectly predicting China's future in front of millions of TV viewers, I can only embarrass myself in front of 30 people listening to this presentation. The honest answer is, predicting China is very, very tough. I think in the short term, I don't see much change. I mean, one thing I think, my own sense, just as an observer, is that in recent years, developments in China there has really been a kind of sea change, and that China under Xi Jinping is qualitatively different than it was in the sort of 30 plus years from the start of the reform and open door till sort of through the Beijing Olympics. And you're seeing this in the adoption of domestic policies that undo a great deal of what constituted the earlier reform and opening up. You're seeing it in the reimposition of much tighter political controls, ideological education, much more suspicion towards foreigners, and the difficulties that the foreign companies are having, and the difficult, the way that you don't see the same number of people visiting, and the contacts are much more circumscribed. So I think, if anything, in the next couple of years, things in China are going to get tighter, and we're going to all have to deal with that. But of course, things can change. And when I went to China in 1973, I walked across this wooden covered bridge from at the Lowu border crossing from Hong Kong into Shenzhen, which was a small fishing village of a few streets and a few water buffalo. And if somebody had said to me 25 years later, Shenzhen is going to look like an extension of Hong Kong, I would have said they were completely crazy. And of course, that's exactly what happened. So much for predicting China.
Right. Thanks so much. One of the narratives that has emerged, Mike, since the war in Ukraine is that China and Russia are in lockstep. They've declared this no limits friendship, and they're supporting each other and whatnot. But I think in the news of the past few days, for me, it also underscored the differences between China and Russia. What do you think of the assumption that, China watching is like, criminology, they're very, very similar? I think there are some similarities, but there are also some great differences.
Well, how many criminologists predicted what we saw in Russia last week, including, not just the journalists, but even the folks in the intelligence community? I think the Chinese, at least publicly, have been, full-on embrace of Putin, and trying to walk this line where they're full-on embrace of Putin while pretending to be slightly more balanced on Ukraine. I would think that what's happened will have given them pause first of all, that I'm assuming that they may be revisiting their calculations about the outcome of the war in Ukraine. I think domestically, the lesson is going to be better make sure that the party controls the gun in China. There's not going to be anybody like, what's his name, Prigozhin, allowed to emerge. And if anything, I think you'll likely see even tighter controls by the party over the military to make sure that nothing like this could happen. There's an interesting question about, will it affect their calculations on Taiwan? I'm of the view that for all of the, anxiety coursing through the public discourse, the odds of a full-on Chinese attack on Taiwan are very small, although I think Beijing would like people to be scared, because it will mean a greater chance of Taiwan acquiescing to what China wants, and you're going to see a lot of military posturing, as kabuki theater to score political points. But, you know, the whole Ukraine episode, from the war going as badly as it did to this internal mutiny, would, I think, you know, bring home very vividly that once one starts something, there's no telling how it's going to play out. So that might be another factor inducing restraint in terms of Chinese calculations on Taiwan. But no one's telling me this from Zhongnan High, so this is all total speculation.
Yeah, just as a footnote, during that dinner where Francesco and I were discussing, Francesco himself had brought up, you know, independently, he said, I get the feeling that Chinese officials are terrified at the possibility of a collapse in Moscow, and then all these loose nukes, and they'll be, you know, that'll be terrifying for everyone. And we chatted about that for a while, and then I said something like, and yeah, look at this Wagner group. They're, you know, the guy is criticizing the defense minister. What if he committed a coup? Ha ha ha. And we all laughed, like as if it were outlandish. And then, you know, here it is.
Well, I mean, you know, I think you know, things you don't anticipate do happen. And while you know, the sort of you know, things are politically calm and orderly and very tightly controlled in China, and the controls have gotten tighter. One of the things that's so interesting, the journalists who tell their stories in Assignment China talk about trying to make sense of, without having a lot of close-up evidence of these various monumental leadership upheavals. Journalists were sitting in Hong Kong during the Great Leap Forward. They were sitting in Hong Kong during the Cultural Revolution when Mao's heir was purged and so on. They were sitting in Hong Kong. One of the very interesting stories in Assignment China, Henry Bradshaw, who worked for the now defunct Washington Star newspaper, and whose son Keith is New York Times correspondent, but was in Hong Kong. And he actually went to China with Nixon. But he talks about in September of 1971, monitoring the Xinhua news agency, and there was a Chinese delegation that was visiting Vietnam. And the first Xinhua report said a welcoming banquet. The toasts were raised to Chairman Mao and his close comrade in arms, Marshal Lin Biao. And about a week later, there was the return banquet, and the Xinhua commentary said, toasts were raised to Chairman Mao. And Bradshaw said, light bulb went off. Why didn't they mention Lin Biao? Of course, we now know the official line is he tried to stage a coup. And then you had the Gang of Four, and then you had Zhao Ziyang ousted in 1989, and you had the Bo Xilai case in 2012. So the Communist Party has a track record of not always having things go smoothly at the top. And just because you can't see it, I'd be very surprised if that happens now, but you can't rule this stuff out. And I think that's partly what the lesson from the Russian experience in Ukraine in this past weekend is. Things that are sort of unimaginable do end up happening and need to be aware of it. And of course, Xi Jinping is learning that same lesson and doing everything he can to make sure it won't happen.
Right. Okay, another question from someone in the audience, Xenia Piesh, one of the founding members, very early members of the RASBJ. Mike, how do you feel that reduced budgets and higher turnover times aggravate the problem of restricted access, language barriers, etc., issues that complicate informed reporting on China? My late stepfather, who was a journalist in China for many years, always lamented the problems arising from journalists, getting increasingly reduced budgets and time to channel their, quote, inner Ladani, as you so nicely put it.
Well, I mean, it's another big problem for coverage of China is, in fact, the general crisis in the world of American and Western media. The business model is broken. News organizations are constantly tightening their budgets. Many, I mean, you can count the number of prominent American news organizations who had bureaus in China when we were both there, you know, in the late 80s, early 90s that the Boston Globe had a bureau, the Baltimore Sun had a bureau, the Chicago Tribune had a bureau. Joe Kahn, who's now the editor-in-chief of the New York Times, started out for the Dallas Morning News. None of those news organizations, I don't know if they have any foreign correspondents. They certainly don't have any in China. And so apart from the really big ones like the New York Times and so on that have resources, it's a big problem. And you add to that limitations on the number of staff imposed by the Chinese. And it means, again, going back to the example, the idea that somebody could, I'm just going to go off to Hubei for 10 days and come back and tell you what it's like in the countryside in Hubei, it's next to impossible. And then one other factor is that the emergence of the internet and the demands this places on journalists to be to serve multiple platforms. I mean, when I joined CNN, I did television stories. By the time I left CNN, there was a CNN.com website, there was CNN radio, and I left before you had, Twitter and Facebook and YouTube and all the rest of that. So the pressure now to be online all the time means that it's a very lucky news organization and correspondent who can say, I'm going to be off the grid. I'm not going to be tweeting for our Twitter account because I'm going to be on a boat on the Yangtze River for the next 5 days. And so the result is you lose that. And I think that's really not good for deeper understanding of China. So it's an absolutely valid point.
Yeah. And here's another question relevant to the sort of restricted activities of foreigners in general, even. Dr. Ansa Lee, who's based in Hong Kong, says, great to see you, Mike. A former client of mine recently returned from Beijing and reported that foreigners are again required to register to visit some points of interest outside the city. Any comment and or verification?
I can't answer that because I'm not there. Maybe you can.
Well, Alan and I have been traveling for a couple of weeks, so it might be true now when it wasn't true before. Well, okay, what's happened is a localization of restriction. If you go back to like 2006, one would have to, a foreign correspondent would have to apply for permission from provincial authorities in order to travel to that province. And the great innovation in 2007, which was very much related to the Summer Olympics of 2008, to show China was open and international and cosmopolitan, was that as long as you had someone agreeing to be interviewed in that locality, you could pretty much go. Tibet was a special case. It still remains a special case. Tibet is pretty much off limits to foreign media unless you go as part of a group under foreign ministry supervision. So I haven't been to Tibet in a really long time. But the interesting thing about just points of interest is that today, local authorities can cite all kinds of things going on to you as reasons why you can't go there. Or they just make it difficult for you to work. Like if you go to Xinjiang to report on the situation with Uyghurs, you'll be followed, surveilled, sometimes detained. It becomes very, very difficult. So even though you can't say there's a blanket regulation that anyone can point to, the reporters can't go there. But essentially, it's hard to do any meaningful on-the-ground reporting there. And even very minor things, like if there's a natural disaster or even a man-made disaster, some kind of disaster with loss of life involved, very often local authorities will say something like, this is an emergency situation, this is a rescue situation, ordinary people for their own safety are not allowed to go. So that can cover all kinds of things. Yeah.
My sense is that most times no one is going to physically stop you as a foreign correspondent from getting on the high-speed train in Beijing and going to Wuhan, or getting on a plane and going to Kunming. But your presence will be noticed, you will be monitored, and depending on what it is, you are very likely to have people follow you ask you what you're doing, strongly discourage local people from talking to you. So whereas before you were violating the rules, you physically couldn't leave Beijing without the permission. Now I think you can physically get to more places, but to actually do the journalism is a problem. And another thing I think that makes it hard is the ordinary Chinese have been fed a diet in their state-run media for the last few years of how bad and how anti-China the foreign press is and how they're all biased and so on. And even without officials discouraging ordinary folks, I interviewed people for Simon China who talked about encountering essentially spontaneous hostility from locals in different places that they went once it became clear they were journalists, because these folks thought that journalists were bad and doing terrible things and giving, so that's another factor militating against the ability of journalists to get out and sort of get the story.
Right. And we've got another comment here from Adam Ensign, who actually is in Beijing. He's a longtime RASBJ member who had been there for many years, was stuck in the States during part of the pandemic, and now is back. So he would have been watching all these things very closely. And he says, on this point of restricted access, I think it would depend on what is meant by foreigners, quote unquote. If you're talking correspondents, that may be one thing, but regular foreigners who work in China and are not correspondents may not face the same restrictions. Registration has always been required at hotels. So that would be registration of a kind. And I can confirm this, once upon a time, a foreigner could stay in some pretty primitive hotels. Now there are some that are permitted to accept foreigners and others that are not, even in Beijing. So this registration is one of the key choke points of, if people want to keep track of you, if you want to stay somewhere, then you have to show your passport. They take a Xerox or a scan of your visa, and it starts from there. We've got another comment from Hava, one of our council members. As well as restrictions placed by officials, our correspondents increasingly finding local Chinese do not trust them. The idea of fake news, quote unquote, which I've heard thrown around quite a bit. Excellent question. What do you think, Mike?
It goes to the point I was making before. I think the official Chinese media narrative about the foreign press has fueled this perception, and of course that's where I think the Trump years were so incredibly damaging to a free press, not only in the States, but because it gave authoritarian regimes all over the world ammunition to discredit foreign journalists. In the book, in the Simon China, there are a number of journalists talking about who talk about the tactics over the last, sort of dozen years that reporters have had to adopt in order to get the story. And I think it's Louisa Lim, who worked for NPR, talking about how you'd fly into one city, you'd get a taxi, you drive somewhere, you change to another taxi, you try and find a place to stay that wasn't a hotel, so you didn't have to register, or you'd fly in, do your job, and fly out without staying in a hotel. The term that she uses, it's tradecraft in almost a spy way. Not that journalists are spies, but somebody else talked about literally being driven around by a taxi, like a green taxi, and being followed, and the taxi driver was very sympathetic, and so they drove into this parking lot with multiple green taxis, and he said, "Get out, keep low. The guy in the next green taxi is my friend. He'll take you." So it's like it's seen out of the movies, but that is what has happened, has increasingly become the norm in this kind of game of cat and mouse, and it vastly complicates the ability to get information and talk to people if you're looking over your shoulder and you're playing these endless games to ward off people who are tailing you, who are trying to stop you. And it's so, and it also, I think, of course, accentuates, I mean, if journalists, I've always felt that foreign correspondents interacted with the most retrograde parts of the Chinese system. And it's interesting, for example, Jim McGregor, who came to China in 1990 for the Wall Street Journal, left in the mid-90s to become the corporate representative of the journal's parent company. And his experience as a journalist and his experience as a business person utterly different. Suddenly, once he wasn't a journalist anymore, people would see him, he wasn't being followed, he got access, and so the result is that journalists are constantly being treated that way. It simply accentuates all the negative feelings. And I don't think I mean, my feeling is most journalists who go to China do not have a quote unquote anti-China agenda. In fact, most of them like China enough to have spent years learning the language. They're willing to put up with all the aggravations to live there. I mean, I showed up in China with a 4-month-old and a Labrador retriever. So it's not like I went to a place I hate, quite the contrary. But I think you in your interview, Melinda, talk about how it sort of ground people down after a while. And I think the result is that journalists are born cynics, but if you're treated like this day in and day out, month in and month out, year in and year out, no wonder people take a pretty jaundiced attitude about the system.
Right. I totally agree, Mike. I agree with you there. I also agree with Adam and Hava, who make the distinction between non-journalist expats and correspondents. In fact, Adam said, I was just up in Chongping over the Duanwu Jie weekend, the Dragon Boat Festival weekend, and rode a shared rented bike around villages with no restrictions. Adam, you were probably up near our cottage over there. Yeah, and when you can do that sort of unrestricted, free, wandering and meandering, it's wonderful. But journalists are increasingly not treated like every other expat. And indeed, in a couple of days, I'm going to do another interview. Someone's going to interview me about the ramifications of the new anti-espionage law in China, which very much kind of makes ambiguous what sort of information, the passage of what sort of information, constitutes espionage. And, when you look at it, if journalists are really doing their job, just as, if a due diligence company is really doing their job, it would fall under that category because it's very, very tenuous, ambiguous, and hard to define. So, yeah, there's definitely been an exodus of expats in general, but I think the journalistic expat exodus has been even more pronounced.
Yeah. And I think if journalists could have the kind of experience that Adam talked about, it would balance out the built-in cynicism that all reporters in the Western media have about authority of all kinds. And it's not, this is what when I've had this conversation with Chinese officials over the years, it's not as if journalists in Washington go easy on who's president, or in London. It's just, it's the nature of the beast. But if you block out that other side, it accentuates the negative, and you don't allow journalists to have more positive feelings that might be reflected in their reporting.
Right. Okay. And we're actually getting close to our allotted time. All good things come to an end. But I've got a number of private messages over the Zoom chat of people who are interested to read your book. So shall I just tell them they can get it on Amazon?
The book is available on Amazon. The main book is a paperback, but there is also an ebook, which might be easier if you're having it shipped, if you're not in the States. And there's now an audio book, if you like that, that's just literally come out. So it is available on Amazon and all the other standard platforms. And I hope folks will, I mean, to me, I'll just close by saying part of what's so interesting to me in this whole process is for those of us in the profession, it's fascinating to learn about people who came before, because they were quite an extraordinary bunch, the early folks who covered China. And the stories like Morley Safer, who became famous as a correspondent for 60 Minutes, CBS News, was a Canadian. And in 1967, at the height of the Cultural Revolution, he pretended to be, I forgot, an architect, an art historian, and with a British cameraman who pretended to be a travel agent, they got tourist visas and they spent a month in China at the height of the Cultural Revolution, and they produced an hour-long film called Morley Safer's Red China Diary, which I'd never heard of. But his account of traveling around and his interactions with the Red Guards and so on is quite extraordinary. And so I think for people, it's want to know what came before. And also, I think in general, the more informed people are about how journalists work, the more sophisticated consumers of news you will be, and the more intelligently you'll be able to process the stuff that comes at you on the internet or in the newspaper or on radio and TV. And I think given how critical China is, that's very valuable.
Absolutely. Thanks so much, Mike. Really appreciate it. And it's so great to catch up with you after all the,
before 45 years go by.
Yeah, let's not wait another 45 years.